welcome to the Fireside Chat, episode 38, with Daniel Fox as our special guest. We both have some Kickstarters running today, so it's like a double shout out. So on our end, we've got the Ultimate Viking anthology that's down to like 6 days. And Daniel's got a Blackbirds Kickstarter that's running until the end of December. So welcome, Daniel. Why don't
Thank
you
you. Thanks for having me.
tell us a little bit about yourself as an intro to our audience?
Yeah, well, first off, congratulations on Kickstarter. I know you got like 6 or 5 days left, I think, on the one you're running right now,
Yeah,
right?
six left.
Yeah, that's great. So, hi everybody. I'm Daniel. I'm a game guy. I make games professionally, I guess you could say, at a company called Anders McNeil Publishing, here in Kansas City, Missouri. Publisher's been around for about 52 years. I joined a little over 2 years ago at this point. I had kind of an unusual entrance into the RPG industry, given that I was working, for the past 19 years prior to this in agency world. But I was always an RPG gamer at heart. I had gamed for decades. Wrote a little RPG called Zweihander, and it kind of took off faster than I thought. And then that eventually led to here, where I'm now the kind of executive creative director, and my role is essentially to build Zweihander, to build RPGs and work with really cool creative people, and to do some acquisitions of other books that are out there, but mostly it's to develop games around Zweihander and games that are powered by it as well.
Awesome, awesome. And so it's really cool that you've actually gone from the publishing space into publishing your own games. Talk about like serendipity. It's such a nice little marriage of an existing career with where you want to go in life. And we ended up meeting in
Yeah.
what, Gen Con 2018, I think. You had a booth with, I think,
hmm
Studio 2. I think he
hmm
was warehousing both of us, and I was walking by, and I'm like, "What is this gorgeous big book?" And I think you had just come off of your Kickstarter at that point, and oh my goodness, that's not a small project. You were saying a small book. Why don't you hold that up there? It's behind you. I see it. You can't miss it. It's on your
Yes,
bookshelf, I think.
I've got I've got
I
I've
got one
got
right
one
here.
here,
There you
but
go.
I would say the more impressive book in my collection is this one here,
Oh,
because in fact the first time that we met was the last day of the convention, and I remember you were wearing a kilt that day, and you were walking the convention on Sunday, and it was like kind of like end of day, and we're like, hey, we should meet, hey, we should swap books, and ever since I've just constantly fawning over how beautiful this book is. I really love the systems that you developed into it. I love the Mystic Rune system. It's so cool. But I'm very thankful and fortunate that you gave me a copy of this when we met. But the thing I lament is that I didn't have an opportunity to have you sign it.
oh well, we're gonna
So
have to correct
next,
that on both ends.
yeah,
Because still tell the
yeah, next,
story because you were totally cool when we ended up meeting, because a lot of publishers, when we end up meeting, a lot of us get damaged goods that show up to the show. Something got damaged in transit and stuff.
yeah,
And so what we try to do is like trade between publishers. Oh, you got some damaged books, I've got some damaged books, let's trade. And I come up to Daniel and I'm like, Daniel, you got any damaged books we can trade? And he goes, for you, here. He takes a perfectly mint one off the shelf and just hands it to me. And I'm like, what the hell, man? This guy's too cool for school, man. Like that was just like I hadn't seen that before from many publishers, so I've always given you this little shout out for that story of that was something memorable. That was really cool of you.
well, we're all at the end of the day, like I think all of us we're game collectors. Like I'm sure, like you, like a lot of gamers, I collect more books than I actually am able to play,
Yep.
and I'm a big proponent of like, well, if you're gonna gift somebody something, gift them something worthwhile and in a condition, if they decide to shelf it, that they could pull it off and it still feels nice later on. So um, in fact, before we went to the convention, we were very careful about ensuring that the books we packaged in boxes were undamaged, because I didn't want to run the risk of being like, oh, we're down to like 2 books and I'm so sorry, here's this janky book. But we were very fortunate, but I'm very thankful that we had the opportunity to meet, and now gosh, almost like 2 years later, full circle, like we had an opportunity to talk one-on-one like this, which is super cool. So thank you.
It's very nice. Yeah, that's one of the things that I wanted to do during the pandemic was start this fireside chat because there were a lot of people in our industry that were like hurting. They were blue. Like I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of us creative types were just like, "Oh, we got all the time in the world. We're shuttered in, no conventions. We're going to just be super creative and write a bunch of stuff." And that wasn't the reality for a lot of creative types. A lot of creative types just dropped into a depression, anxiety, because of just lack of funds with no stores closing and conventions shutting down. A lot of them weren't able to write. And I remember when we started getting together online just to chat, me and my team, we fought off the blues that way. And then I said, you know what? Let's just start inviting other
Yeah.
people from the industry into this chat, and like on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, and just to get everyone just out of their funk because we had all suffered quite a bit, I think, in this industry for the last 18 months. So it was good to get all the friendly faces, at least on virtual screens, before we can kind of coordinate on when we're meeting face to face and sharing a drink together.
Yeah, I agree. It's I know a lot of creators who, kind of use this opportunity during the pandemic to create. And I think, for me it was kind of a sense of catharsis. It's like this worldwide terrible event. These things that like we write about in RPGs happening in the real world. And I have, I know several friends who really struggled through it creatively. Some people knuckled down, were able to kind of push through. Some people use their art, I think, as a way to kind of cope with reality. I feel the RPGs are kind of rooted in that, to be something that you're not, or to avoid the looming pandemic and reality, that doesn't have to exist, in a fantasy world at the time. So I think it's really cool that you use that opportunity to invite other creators on to do these fireside chats. I've watched several because they inevitably pop up in my YouTube recommendations, and I've subscribed to your channels. So I catch them every once so often, and I'm always amazed at the guests you're able to bring on. So it is an honor to
Ah,
be on the show today with you. This is super cool.
I'm very happy to have you on, and I got to tell you, like you mentioned, we have too many RPGs that we can get realistically to the table, but yours is one that I just keep going back to and flipping through, and it's just like my wheelhouse. It's kind of dark and gritty and apocalyptic, and healing and resurrection are few and far between or non-existent. It's kind of like you got to like make your choices. It's not kick in the door, roll for initiative, and the cleric will take care of us later, kind of deal. And I just love that setting, and I'm like, I got to get this out to a table, and it's one day, man, because it just keeps getting more and more fingerware. It just needs to get some tableware.
Well, I think, what's interesting, I hear a lot of people talk about Zweihander, and it's like getting people to try something new, not try something beyond D&D is tough.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of the foremost challenge all of us, yourself included, face trying to get people to play our games. But I oftentimes hear from people that are like, I pull out Zweihander and I use the random tables in the back for my Dungeons and Dragons game, or I use it for my DCC game. People will use it as a source of reference for their own game to create house rules, or just like the random encounter tables and stuff. So to me, it's just it's I'm just flattered that people will buy the book. I'm even more flattered if they play the game. But if you're looking to really dive in sometime, I'm more than happy to run you through a one shot.
I would love it.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, we got to figure out what conventions are lining up for us because I'm doing PAX Unplugged, and of course, we were just speaking before the stream that you won't be able to attend PAX Unplugged. The next one for me is GaryCon, and then after that, probably PAX East. I don't know what's 2022 looking for you.
Yeah, 2022. I think it's definitely gonna be. We have to do Gamma because that's a thing we have to do as a publisher, so the B2B stuff. But the fun conventions I get to go to, Origins. I'm looking at Gamehole Con, like you suggested I should.
Yes.
Definitely Gen Con. PAX Unplugged, my favorite show. I'm very sad I'm not going this year, but next year. And then I'm looking to squeeze a few other conventions into, providing I can talk to the company and they allow me to take a couple extra flights or just drive there and pay for everything. So we'll see what it turns out to be. But regardless, I can always run a game online for you, despite the convention schedule. But always better in person, but online will work too.
So that's true. So have you been running games over the last 18 months on like a virtual tabletop or anything like that?
That's a great question. So my home gaming group, we game every Wednesday, and we've been gaming religiously all the way up until the pandemic. And I've gamed with these people for a little over a decade plus. Many of them actually play tested Vikiing and Flames of Freedom and other games we've worked on. So right on our this is no shit, right on our 69th game session, which was in February, right when the pandemic hit, we stopped playing in person, and we had played 69 sessions at that point. We were playing this thing I've been writing called Queen of Embers, and it was this big ongoing campaign we played for a year and a half. So pandemic hit, and we're like, well, I guess we got to learn how to play differently, because I was never a person who played online. Although I'm familiar with Roll20, where I mean, Viking's on Roll20, but I was never I was not born playing on a VTT. I'd always played traditionally in person. So our group decided we're going to try something remote. We're going to do it on Roll20. We started completely fresh, completely new. We did 22 sessions online of another campaign that I started. And then right after we all got our full vaccination in, I believe it was March of this year or April, one of the two, we resumed in-person gaming once we all felt good about it. We have a couple of people who are immunocompromised at the table, so we waited the appropriate amount of time and it took the proper precautions. But we resumed in-person gaming in March, and we've been gaming since then, and it's so refreshing. I love the opportunity that VTT provides to play online, but and nothing beats playing in person, that's for sure.
Hell yeah. That was my take because we were getting Children of Eru out the door just about the time the pandemic hit. And we were doing like weekly, even
Yeah.
twice a week, we were running our final beta tests. And then the pandemic hits and I'm like, we got more to do. Tried Roll20 and you know our system with runes, right? So we're like, how the hell are we going to do
Yeah.
this online? And so we reskinned the deck mechanic in Roll20 to do runes
Hmm.
instead of the deck of cards, and we gave everyone a custom deck. And I played, I think, 2 games online, and I just wanted to shoot myself. I'm like, this is not going to work. I can't handle this. Like, I'm an in-person old grognard. Like, give me my runes, give me my players around a table. But then I had 2 developers that were in my game, and they said, give us 2 weeks and we can get set up macros, we can set up character sheets, we can set up, all these virtual tabletops that are going to have your play mats and minis and your character sheets and everything. And I said, I don't believe it, but I'll believe it when I see it. 2 weeks later, we log in and it's just running butter smooth. We got all these little buttons at the bottom that they've created. You're hitting a button, runes are popping out onto the table. You hit another button, they all get cleaned up into your bag. You can tap them to rotate them. You mouse over them. You've got the abilities that they're tied to. Your character sheets. I was blown away. So we're really spoiled this in this day and age. Like with Kickstarter, with print on demand, and now with virtual tabletop, it's our industry is just booming. Like we're lap of luxury. I would say we're really spoiled. We're lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool that they're able to develop that. I know that there's another VTT I was introduced to called Purple Board, and Purple Board allows you to have like secondary cameras where you can put it on terrain, and you can move your figure around like virtually on the physical terrain using a mouse cursor for the game master to see. I thought it was a very clever kind of approach, but we struggled. A lot of the kind of the shorthand that we use when you know people, you have a shorthand, and a lot of the side talk at the table that really helped us develop characters. Like this just wasn't present online. It's a very different rhythm
Mm-hmm.
than playing in person. And I know obviously there's a lot of new people to the hobby just in general, but especially during the pandemic. But knowing that people have entered the hobby through virtual tabletops and then getting to play in person, especially a long-term campaign with people, like that is that's the hope I have, I guess, whatever our new world looks like in 2022 and beyond, that everyone has an opportunity who just started playing games, in 2021. they have that opportunity to play in person again, because I certainly missed it. The gamers missed it, it's a treat to be able to actually, like share bags of chips and move figures on tables and set up big battle scenes and just have like the body language that you can't really express well on a VTT unless you're a stage actor, I guess, like, big movements. But there's just that shorthand I missed about being in person. And I really appreciate the opportunity to start gaming again. And we're going to continue doing so unless anything changes with Omicron or whatever it's called. We continue gaming in person
That's the new
until it
Transformer, right?
becomes unsafe. I know, that's right. Autobots roll out. That's the first thing I thought of was like Optimus Prime with his mask on. Yeah, but until some of us, if anyone at the table feels uncomfortable, because it's kind of an all or none thing for us. Like, if we're not all playing in person, none of us are playing in person, and I'm really blessed to have a group of gamers who are very supportive of one another. So until something changes, we're continue playing in person, and if things do change, we'll play remotely again until everyone feels safe and. It's take it step by step, week by week, month by month, day by day.
Yep. Now, one thing for me that has changed my outlook as a publisher, as a game designer over the last 18 months was this accessibility, right? So players are going to be trying to find games now online, virtually. It's like this paradigm has changed. You can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? And so right now I'm looking at how do we make our future game books accessible online? How do we make all our components, all our game mechanics accessible online? Um, and even like our latest Kickstarter, that box set that we're releasing, it's like a city box set. We're looking at how can we release just like a slim down rule book that just gets you playing right away without any kind of like long, oh my god, I got to read a 500-page book. This is our last Kickstarter. um, to get people running without any kind of like hurdles in front. I'm wondering, have you had any kind of little epiphanies or light bulb moments in the last 18 months in terms of how you're changing your approach to the future roadmap of your Zweihander line?
Yeah, I think that I was talking to Gabe Hicks the other day. He's a game writer. He's currently in Dimension 20. He's works for Into the Motherlands, and he's working on a game with us. And we were just having this same conversation around developing for the streaming community. Like, I think if we were to look backwards, gosh, what 50 years now for D&D? The game originates out of chainmail, comes out of a miniature terrain thing on a 4x8 table. So when tables shrunk and D&D was created, they created it for smaller tables or couch and floor spaces. I think things have changed. So when game designers look at how what medium or the game is being played in, but it's not just the table anymore. It's online,
Mm-hmm.
and especially because there have been a number of new gamers, an influx of new gamers following the success of D&D 5th edition, and really coming into the pandemic as well. A lot of new gamers, their first touch is really through online gaming, through VTT. So when we think about how we develop games, we have to consider um, the way that games are being engaged with, and that's around the virtual tabletop as well as the in-person tabletop. And for us, we're kind of we're right now we're working on a starter kit for Zweihander that we're gonna sure we'll talk about at some point today. But we have completely reconcepted how we present information. And this really comes down to I spoke earlier a little bit. I came from the agency world, so I worked in digital advertising. My role there was as a business developer, and a lot of the work that we did was around user experience. So, what's it like to interact with the website online? Is it ADA compliant? Is it accessible? And a lot of UX and accessibility is oftentimes forgotten in RPGs. In fact, I would say, probably in the last maybe 4 to 5 years, it's become kind of a focus for like the big two, so Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons. But especially in the indie game design spaces, I think there's been an influx of UX designers who are thinking about how can we present information that's more accessible, that's less walls of text. How do we break it up using icons? How do we use more negative space on the page? And I think that's extremely important when we think about how we teach our games to new players, teach our games to people who are accustomed to VTTs, who are accustomed to playing online. Certainly, it's helpful for the in-person experience when you're flipping through the book, but really kind of focusing in on UX considerations, colorblind, making sure it's actually accessible that way. I have dyslexia,
Yeah.
so that's informed the way that we've done our new layouts. I mean, really, I think that there's been kind of like a switch I've kind of seen among publishers around like we need to make sure our books are actually readable. Looking back in Zweihander, and this is the big insight for me is like, so I wrote this and it was completed in 2016. It was laid out and published in 2018. And this thing is a monster. And looking backwards, lessons learned. It's like, well, but know now what I knew then. But this is not a highly accessible book, not because of its size, but because of the way the information is presented. I'm a big fan of manuscript style books. That's why I rather like this book right here. I love manuscript style books. There's a aesthetic to it that I love, but you can have that big heavy tome, providing that you're using the right font sizes, the right padding and spacing in paragraphs, presenting information in bite-sized chunks as opposed to big long paragraphs. There's so many different ways you can present information, especially for new gamers, to make it more accessible. That really has been a big shift for us. And in fact, I literally, before I came on tonight, I was just reviewing with our art director, Sierra. We were looking at the sample interior spreads of the starter kit. First conversation we had was like, okay, do we have enough? Is there enough room to breathe on the page? Are we crowding the paragraphs too close together? How large are the headers? Do people have basically a way to like take their thumb and mark when they're going down the paragraphs? I do that as a dyslexic reader. Like I literally take a ruler and I go down the page when I read. So, and it's a common kind of thing they teach you when you're learning to deal with dyslexia. So, we looked at those things and we're putting those things in motion right now for not only just the Zweihander starter kit for next year, but we're also doing it for future Zweihander books too. Same conversation we had around Blackbird's RPG, which is undergoing layout as well. So I guess it's a long way of saying the big insight is like really hyper focus on the UX experience, hyper focus on how information is presented, because we are presenting beautiful narrative and people love to read narrative. People love storybooks, but we also have to remember that we're presenting technical manuals too, and technical manuals, especially when married with narrative, have a certain demand we have to meet to make it actually legible and be able to for people to like absorb the information to retain it when they play. So that's the big insight.
Yeah, look at Glossary. I find a lot of RPGs, they have a lot of technical terms, proprietary terms, especially the ones that don't want to borrow from D&D or the establishment. And so the Glossary is super important. And a lot of times they put them somewhere near the end, like between appendices or indexes. But the most use out of a glossary is right before the rules, right? So if you're going to jump into the rules, let's get the terminology straight. And so you can put a little bookmark in there and go, okay, this is the reference, and then we can start moving forward. And it was the same kind of thing with indexes. Right at the beginning, when we started doing layout, we didn't know how to do indexes in InDesign because we were just starting out. And as soon as we got indexes down, I remember just our player base was like, I think it was by book 3, they were like, thank you, hallelujah, that you've got indexes in your book, right? And we were like, yeah, we're never going back to no indexes. That's a done deal. And then there was another happy accident, which was Lords of the Ash, where I was working with so many chapters that I basically color-coded the backgrounds for each one of those chapters so I can switch between them and know exactly where I was. And then by the end of the layout, I'm like, wait a minute, if I print this with all the different colors in the margins, then anyone just flipping through the book can get to the section as quickly as possible without having to go, like, okay, I need to go to the table of contents, get to the right page. And so ever since we did that color coding, we've stuck with that color coding. So it's like you kind of learn these little things. And when you said color blindness, I laughed because I remember the first time I faced a colorblind player at a table, and I was just in shock because it was something I had never expected to see. We were doing our rune tests and stuff, and she pulls out 2 runes, and she holds them out to the players, and she's like, can someone tell me which one's red and which one's green? And I was sitting there going like,
Hmm.
oh crap. Suddenly,
Yeah.
like just quick, right. And ever since then, all of our rune sets, if you see the Fate of the Norns rune sets, they have little dots under the Futhark symbols. So all the red runes have a dot on the left, all the blue runes have a dot in the center, and all the green runes have a dot on the right under the actual symbol. So it actually helps the colorblind to figure out which rune is which color. So it's like these little things.
What?
Pardon?
That's a great insight. I think that we only know what we know, right? We
Exactly.
won't know until we test. And that's an important thing I think that people should remember is like, for many people, for publishers, I would say, some of this is a learning experience. Some of it is, we're kind of learning how to do things better.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people gravitate toward like, look at Wizards of the Coast and look at Dungeons and Dragons and look at their layouts. Well, their layouts are imperfect.
Yeah.
I'll give you a great example. So Dungeons and Dragons recently moved from, they used to be at like 8.5 font. That's the point font they had in historic books. And they made a switch in after Descent into Avernus into 10.5 font, which is massive. It's a huge change. Less words per page, more legible. But they aren't necessarily like, I don't think that they're doing the best out there. I think that one game that really comes to mind that I think does information design really well is Old School Essentials. I think his name is Gavin Norman. It's a fantastic layout. It's like it's a retro AD&D, but it's a beautiful book, and the information presentation is so cool. But I think back to what you were saying, like you don't know until you test. You don't know until you can put those things in front of players, because it would never be a consideration, right? So, if only to underscore the importance of playtesting, I guess,
Play
right?
testing is super important. It came up last night. I was in a stream yesterday as a guest on someone else's channel, and testing came up, and people were just saying that just there's no testing going on these days. It's all deadlines. And I go, and it shows. Like I back a lot of Kickstarters, and there's a lot of stuff that shows up, and I'm just like, I would rather waited another 8 months, even a year. Just send me a
Yeah.
product that works because it's super clear that this was not tested. This was written, and it was just a big hail mary. Throw it out and see what happens. We'll errata this as the players start giving us feedback, and especially with board
It's
games,
a
it doesn't work. You can't do it.
Yeah, with I understand. I say I'm more sympathetic, I should say, to people who don't have people or time to play test. Although personally, I I buy role playing games that have been play tested. I have some pretty strong opinions on play testing. I've certainly shared them before, because I think it's essential to make a good game. I don't think every game necessarily needs to be play tested. Sometimes games are just a visual expression of an idea, and they don't demand a play test. I think a lot of games that end up on itch are like that, itch.io, as well as indie games. But I think anytime you decide to ask, my opinion on this is that anytime you ask for $1 for somebody, I think you have a responsibility not only to the person who's buying it, but also to yourself to gather a couple other designers or just friends and like run through a playtest. And when I say playtest, it's not about like let's do some number crunching and all this stuff, because some of that's just kind of like the natural rhythm of the designer and the development side. What you do, people kind of inherently understand how the game should work. But more importantly, when I say playtesting, I mean, does it do what it says on the tin? Does the game do what you're saying it does? If it doesn't, then you need to refactor. So when I think about play testing, it is certainly about the math stuff, and and I love the development side. I also like the design side, but the development side is really where my strength is. That's why I got very strong opinions on playtesting. But I think that most importantly, the thing that's probably the foremost thing in playtesting is that when you put this game in front of somebody, does it do what it says on the exterior of the cover? Like, does Viander feel dark and gritty and complex? And are we seeing characters grow? Are we seeing combat be deadly? Are we seeing really kind of like are we seeing nail biting chase scenes? Like, are those things working how we think they should work? If they're not, we change it. So it is essential, and not only just for ensuring that your book is presentable and legible and accessible, but also that the game actually does what you say it's supposed to do. So
And
I won't rant too much on that, I promise. But
no, but a lot of
but
times,
playtesting is it's very important.
yeah, but a lot of time the playtesting is done by the developer and their friends, and the moment it leaves that little ecosystem, it falls apart. And so I can't stress enough
Yeah,
the
yeah.
fact that you need to, if there's playtesting also has to occur where you ship your game to a table of players that do not know you, have not played your game before,
Yeah.
and they crack it open for the first time. They look at the rules, and you're watching through a webcam in another room. You cannot answer their questions. All you can do is scream at the monitor, going, "Look on page 3, paragraph 4. It's explained right there." And they're going through this, going, "This does not make sense. We don't know how to get past this step." And so that is just absolutely essential. And that's one of the things that I learned in software, because I worked in IT for 22 years before this became my day job.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely essential. And almost every single one of our products, especially the latest ones, always go through that testing. And we go always through that, like, oh crap, like we need to bring this up to the surface. They can't find it. They can't find it fast enough. And so it helps us reorganize. And again, it comes back to UX, right? Is like, how do we get that information to the players, make sure that they can actually play the game.
Yeah, looking back, I mean, so looking back at Zweihander, because this was a game that was written literally in my basement, like a lot of games start out, and I was very lucky to have a number of people I'd known for a long time who were willing to play test. I think, and they're all people I've known for years. I think there's about 15 play testers initially on Zweihander, and that was back in 2016. So now I think about 2020, so the year prior when we were playtesting Flames of Freedom, there's like 48 playtesters on that game.
And
It's a
these are
tale of two
people you don't
cities.
know. You've got
Um,
like tons of this. Now it's
yeah,
in the wild, right? Now you're getting real feedback from real players that are out there that have bought your
yeah,
book, knew nothing about the development process, and are writing in going like, here's my feedback on the game, raw. And that
yeah,
changes everything. And that's great. That's the feedback you want. You know, if in, like, we've
yeah.
got a lot of insiders that watch our fireside chats, either like afterwards or during or on YouTube. And so, like, one of the things that I'll say is when your feedback comes back and your players going like, "I had fun, it was good," that is the worst feedback. Like, you
Yep,
nix that and
not helpful.
you dig, you find out,
Yeah.
something valuable out of that. So yeah, I didn't realize we'd go down the rabbit hole of development, but that's cool.
Well, I love constructive criticism, and I think that's so important for playtesting, especially I think as game authors, designers, developers, what we decide to call ourselves. We get in the box, right? We get in the box, and we're like, "This is how it's supposed to work, and here's how I intend it to work." And then you put it out in the wild, and then now you get the good critical feedback. You're like, now I can apply the razor.
Yeah.
Now I can carve this into the shape that will make sense for other people, not just myself and this other writer and this other writer who may be working on the project. In fact, I learned, for me, having written Zweihander mostly by myself alongside Tanner Ye, and my friends who contributed. One thing on Flames of Freedom, working with a very large team of writers, we had about 21 writers on it,
Oh wow.
was, listening to them, because Flames of Freedom was a tough nut to crack. It's American Gothic horror that takes place in colonial America in 1776. So you're not only dealing with like really cool supernatural spooky stuff, but you're dealing with real world issues like slavery and indigenous servitude and the condition of Black people and women during the time. So when it came time to create this game, it had to be a more collaborative effort, and it taught me to learn to intake information from other writers and other playtesters to hone it down and to editorialize it, because you have to do that. That's a big part of developing a successful game. You have to learn to editorialize your own work and have people who are not yourself edit your work.
Oh yeah.
But that's really that process is so important to intake feedback. And once again, it's Zweihander Starter Kit is the culmination of like almost 6 years of feedback, 6 years of gameplay. So we've been really fortunate to come back with a new thing for it, but it's so critical to get to listen. Not only to listen to playtesters, but listen to gamers who are in the world playing your game, playing your thing that's out there, and finding ways to gather that feedback and to act on it if it necessitates a change. Most people will go to the point of re-editioning. Some people revise. People release errata. Some people produce new products. That's what we're doing with Starter Kit. But
Let's talk about
that
starter kit.
listening
We,
is
we we
important.
keep bringing starter
Yeah.
kit up, so let's
Yeah.
dissect what's in that box, right? So what are you bringing to
Yeah.
market here, so people can jump 2 feet first right into this Vikinger universe with your starter box?
Yeah. So one of the big lessons learned as Vikinger is there's just a lot of information to absorb. Um, I am a consummate overwriter, and God bless my editors for being so forgiving of my trespasses. But it's very evident to me and to other developers on the team that it's a bit of an obtuse book. Once again, it's not the size of the book; it's the way the information is presented. So, we've been thinking long and hard about what Zweihander looks like in the future. As of right now, the engine's being used to develop new games, but we also want to bring Zweihander to new gamers. And I think about the way I came into the hobby when I was a kid with the Red Box. And I was like, why haven't we done a starter kit for Zweihander? Like, how can we give somebody the same experience that I had or other gamers had with the box set? Um, and I had to pitch it internally because there's a whole process behind that. Because I do, although I'm a decision maker, I still have to like go through some money work. Can we do the freelance side? Was looking for production perspective? What's the product launch? But Starter Kit was really the opportunity to condense the most essential elements as Vikinger down.
Hmm?
So the dark fantasy, the corruption stuff, the idea that adventurers are fated heroes, to play into like the social intrigue side, to play into the mystery and the horror, which sometimes can get lost in the sauce. There's a lot there to read. So we sat down and we kind of charted out on a whiteboard, literally like, what are the things that people talk about when they think about Zweihander? So we identified those things and we said, okay, let's redevelop Zweihander using those concepts, and ensure that the starter set is backwards compatible, that it is not a new edition because we did not want to re-edition the game. I think that's kind of dangerous territory, especially for us at this point. Just doesn't make a lot of sense. So we're like, we can't re-edition, so it has to provide a new play experience for gamers who are new to the game, and we believe that
So
our audience are
so
D&D players who will churn.
is it backwards compatible or forwards compatible? Because what I'm hearing is it's almost like a stripped down version of Zweihander. So wouldn't it be like a forward compatible box set in terms of you get a little bit and then there's a
Yeah.
whole lot more ahead of you?
Well, it's a great question. So I think
Or is that a new version of rules?
the way that most, yeah. So the way that most starter kits work is that they take like, okay, here's our game, let's winnow it down and then release it, and then you get this as your taster, it's your appetizer, then you have the full meal, the big book. Well, we didn't want to do that. We
Right.
wanted to ensure that this is fully playable on its own, completely sustainable with just the box set, that you wouldn't need to buy as Binder if you didn't want to. So we provide a play experience essentially up to all throughout basic tier. So that's 20 game sessions it can support in the box set. And if you choose to play more as Zweihander, you can go out and buy the books. Or if you're a Zweihander fan already and you want to get your hands on new content, there's new content inside too. So it's a little bit of stuff for people who are familiar with Zweihander already, with information presented in new ways. And it's a reintroduction, or an introduction to Zweihander for new players, because we feel that D&D gamers are who we want to attract to play this thing. We know that they're going to level up beyond D&D 5th edition. It's been out for almost 8 years now. It's a whole different strategy, but ultimately at the end of the day, and I actually have the white dummy right here of the starter kit. direct from our printer. Um, we wanted to create something that can work backwards and forwards. So you can bolt on Zweihander onto the starter kit, or you can take the starter kit and bring it backwards into your existing Zweihander game.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if I'm understanding, this is kind of like basic D&D versus like AD&D, so you can continue with the basic if you wanted to. If you didn't
Yeah,
want all
it's
of
a
the other
good it's
bells
a
and
good analogy.
whistles. Because yeah,
That's right. It's a great analogy.
this is exactly what ended up happening with my son. So he's joined a lot of like my trips to conventions, and when his friends found out, like, oh, he's getting all these books from conventions, and all they hear is Dungeons and Dragons. Like that's the big one, right? So they're like, oh, can you teach us how to play
Mhm.
Dungeons and Dragons? So he's like, oh, Dad, can I borrow your 5e books? And I'll go make characters with my friends, and we'll play some 5e. So, I hear them in the other room. They've got the books out. Hour and a half, I just see everyone scattering, like after an hour and a half. And my son shows up dejected. And I'm like, what happened? And he goes, we didn't even get through halfway through character creation, and everyone's attention span just, and it was done. And he's just like, I don't know. And so I said,
Yeah.
try one more time, but forget the 5e. We went back to my bookshelf and we grabbed the red box. I brought in the red box and I walked him through the
Yeah.
little booklets there. I said, try this with them. Next time, following week, he gets them all around a table. 20 minutes later, all the characters are made, and I'm hearing them just laughing like hyenas in the other room, having a blast, going on an adventure. That's what you want to have, right? That's what you want to have as your first
That's right.
experience, right there. So when a lot of
Yeah.
people
Keep
say
the
that
fear
5e
low.
is the right first experience, I call shenanigans on that statement completely, just from real life experience. Because if you have to explain what a partial action is, a full round actions, bonus actions, reaction actions, attacks of opportunity, and free 5 foot steps, and like forget about it. A brand new player is like, I don't understand what I can do on my turn, and that happens time and time again.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I think, and there's a valuable lesson in there, too. I think that we looked at with the starter kit, which was we know that getting characters created can be an arduous process in general. In Zweihander, we say randomize everything ground up.
Mm-hmm.
Because we want to move people away. We want to move people away from the standard tropes, like I'm the elven archer, I'm the human fighter. We want to move people beyond that, and because there's so much choice in Zweihander, there's 72 professions. So, like you're explaining with your son in his D&D 5e game, it's analysis paralysis. What is the best build? What is the best thing to do? How do I set myself up for success 5 levels from now? Um, we say in Zweihander, especially in the starter kit, like set aside your notions of like what you're going to play, randomize everything ground up. So profession, ancestry, hair, alignments, drawbacks, everything. Because I believe, and the thing I really like about games is like the idea of like a character as a mosaic, right? They're like all these discordant pieces that don't make sense until you take a 15-foot step back and you can see the character. And Zweihander really leans into the idea of like the mosaic as the character. Like you'll get all these kind of unusual things that will make sense initially on paper. But for the starter kit, like the other goal was like allow people to create a character in 10 minutes or less,
Yeah,
which we've achieved through rigorous testing. And we do that through the use of a Mad Lib. Our actual character sheets start with the Mad Lib at the top that basically is a series of 5 sentences that describe what your character is, and you randomly generate all of that, and then everything else falls nest beneath of it, because the story of your character is perhaps more important than the math behind your character.
agreed.
And that's what we do there. And to your point around the red box, I think it's fantastic. This was one of the things I pulled off my shelf when I was thinking, a year ago, like, what does the starter set look like? And I'm like, it's got to be fast to create characters. You can get right into the adventure. And even though Zweihander is a medium crunch game, it's complex. It's about as complex as 5e. It's a little simpler in some ways, but we did want to ensure that people wouldn't have to have a difficult time learning it. So we provide a lot of guardrails as well as handholds for both players to learn to play while they read,
Yeah.
in game masters to teach, to tell a story while they run the adventure. So, we can, it's kind of a hat trick we pulled off, because we were somehow able to do this without dumbing down the material, keeping it mature, keeping it fresh. keeping it brisk and light in its execution, to where a new game master could come to Zweihander and be like, okay, I get it. And the new players could come and be like, I understand what a role playing game, I understand what Zweihander's role playing game is. And that's the kind of like winning combination. I hope when we bring it to sell it next year, when it actually is finally done, I hope people have the similar experience. But the feedback we've got from I think we had like 29 playtesters on this. The feedback, even though we got good critical feedback, it was roundly, this is a much easier experience than core Zweihander.
Send me a
But I
copy.
cannot. But the other
I
bit of
want to
feedback was like,
test this.
yeah,
You
I'll send it your way if you want to take a look at it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because one of the
Yeah.
things that I wanted to do with the runic game system when we ended up switching from dice, because I don't know if you know the history of Fate of the Norns, it used to be a percentile system in the 90s and only switched to dice in around 2006, to runes in 2006. That's a
Mhm.
result of the Euro board game invasion, where the Euro board
Yeah.
game designers, they said, forget mechanics. The very first thing you need to look at is what is the player dynamic you want at the table? What is the health of the player interactions? What do you want as activity and interest from the players? And then you build the mechanics to scaffold that. And so this is the reason why I
Yeah.
ended up going with the runes, because how many times do you end up getting an RPG that you love the setting, like the IP that you bought it for, but then when you buy the mechanics, you're set into one level of crunch. But if you've been like
Yeah.
playing RPGs for more than like 5, 10 years, you know that everyone at the table has a different tolerance from crunch. Someone's going to be like, "Yeah, let's play Fate," and the person that loves Rollmaster is like, "Shoot me now," and then like, "Hey, let's play Shadowrun," sixth, and the person that loves the flowery, 10 candles kind of like storytelling is going to be like, "I'm lost. I have no idea what's going on with all these numbers and rules." So one of the goals that I wanted to do was introduce a set level of different levels of crunch that you can end up having in the game system on the fly. So everyone at the table can play at the level of crunch they want, and the system ties together in real time. And you couldn't do it with runes, with dice. We had to go with runes because we needed to go with actions. So at the lowest level of like crunch, it was just pure narrative. Simply describe what you want to do, and for every verb you use, it costs you a rune. So you say, okay, I draw my sword, I flip the table, and I stab the guy in the face. Well, that's going to be 3 runes. Flip, draw, stab, right? And then you
Yeah.
go up one level of crunch. If you're comfortable with that, you want to go to the next level of crunchiness in the system. Every single one of those runes has a symbol, and those symbols are tied to your special abilities, which are powers and spells and talents. So you can play those symbols, trigger those powers. And so that's pretty straightforward. All right, cool. So then the players are like, give me the next level of crunch. I want to start getting combos in. Well, now you can combine runes together to create rune chains, change the way powers work. And so you can put runes together to add range, area, multis, amplifies, and you can change the way the root power works by adding more runes to that rune chain. And so you cannibalize multiple actions into a single action that can do more. It's hard to explain here, like on without something as a virtual tabletop. But the nice thing was, in the end, we could end up teaching Crunch Zero in 2 minutes at a convention, and that was my goal. Was I can have you playing my game in 220 seconds or less at the game table, and then you'll watch someone else go, "Oh, how did he cast that?" Well, you see on your character sheet, there's a little symbol there. And then, well, how did he cast that across the room and hit all those guys over there? Well, if you combine your runes, do you learn the rest of the game as you play? But the lowest level of entry is we get you playing right away. But there's levels of crunch in the system that are optional. You can go up to those levels of crunch if you want to. And that's kind of a design paradigm I would love to see more of in RPG, where you can have different levels of that crunchiness and everything gets tied together in real time. So everyone can play at the level of crunch they enjoy. And that would be like, kind of like my challenge to throw out there that we try to do more of as an industry, because it's just it's a persistent problem that we see at every game table, right? Where there's always these people that have different levels of tolerance for math and rules. And we have to overcome that, I think. That's something that
Yeah. Not to make a pun, but I think there's something very elemental about casting runes. I think that everyone can. and fundamentally understand the idea of the ante and the gamble aspect of cards, right? You ante up a certain number of runes, and you may not have those available to you later on. But I love the idea of like the exponential crunch. Like you can become more crunchy as you play. That's hard to pull off. I think that what I've read of this book does it very well. And I think that in other cases, like where you start to see games, I think about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Third Edition, which is I think a bemoaned edition by people who were big Warhammer fans. I loved it.
Was that the one that came
I thought
with
it was
a
really clever.
box with a whole bunch of little like widgets
Yeah.
inside and stuff?
Yeah, I love it for reasons that I love highly complex games. That it was such a novel concept because you would have to interpret the dice. You had like certain dice that would cancel each other out, and you had different powers that augment those dice. But at the heart of it all was this really interesting dice system that eventually was adapted into their Star Wars system and became surprisingly more complex. I don't know how, but I think there's something there. There's something there. Like there's a DNA that ties back to board games and to your point around Euro board games,
Yep.
um, that I think if I'm looking into my crystal ball, if we look at games 5-10 years from now, RPGs, specific tabletop RPGs, I think we're going to see more growth in that, because I think that there is. I think coming out of the pandemic, especially as games start to resume in person, um, people are I mean, math rocks are great, um, but I don't know if they're the best way to express a role playing game at times. I think to the point you made earlier, around all have different need states. Like some people want complex games, some people want narrative games, some people want middle of the road games. And in all games that use dice, suffer from that challenge you spoke about. It's like teaching the game.
Yeah.
It goes back to where we started, which is like, how do you teach the game? How do you make it? How do you present that information in a way that makes sense? It's tough. I don't have the mind for it.
I
Honestly, it's
couldn't
not.
do it with dice. That's
That's def-
why if I
yeah,
had the answer, I would say,
yeah.
okay, let's just do it with dice. That's the reason I went to runes. But I throw out the challenge for the people that love dice. There's got to be a way to do it because it was like uncharted waters for me. It took me 4 years to come up with the mechanics. So it was just completely something that hadn't been done, and I had to like, kind of figure it out, trial and error, brick wall, restart again. And starting with dice, I was just like, it was not doable. I had to go to another medium to try and get that working. And I think one of the, I think catalysts was I remember sitting at a game of Pathfinder or D&D where it was like I think 6 players and a GM, and it was like 20 minutes between turns in a combat, and I rolled like a
Hmm.
2, and then I waited 20 minutes for my turn, and I rolled a 3. And I'm like, I don't have a lot of time during the week to play, and I've just spent 40 minutes of my evening doing nothing. Like, nothing has happened.
Hmm.
I do not want a game system where nothing happens. And I almost wished I rolled a 1 because at least something interesting would have happened with a critical fail, right? And so with the runes, that was one of the things that I could fix, which was you always have something that you can do. They're your runes, they're your actions, and then it's an action reaction paradigm, right? So you kind of change it from
Yeah.
asking the dice for permission to a paradigm of I'm doing something, what are you going to do about it to the person that you're doing it to,
Yeah.
right? Do you want to burn your actions to change my outcome? And so it becomes a more of a resource management choice. It becomes
I'm I'm a big I'm a fan of like the what do you want to do about it as opposed to how do you want to do this. Those are two very different fundamentally two very different ways of playing. I think that D&D has taught us like what are you going to do? It's such a weird open-ended question. But to say what do you want to do about it, right? A reactive style play. There's something there. There's something really intriguing there, that isn't the way that most role playing games are built. Um, that requires a very different mindset. But I think that as people start to look away from D&D, and in the same ways that we did when we grew up, like we gravitated toward other games.
yeah,
Um, we are in this. We're in this state now, with all these influx of new players. They're 4 or 5 years into playing D&D. Came in through Critical Role and Geek and Sundry, and now they're looking like what else is out there. Um, in introducing uh, Ragnarok to them, or introducing new games to them,
There are
and just in
so many
general. Like,
great
now is the prime time.
ideas.
Yeah,
It's unbelievable. I love it. It's just
yeah.
like, as you know, I work like crazy during conventions, but like you said, Sunday afternoons, I break out of the booth and I walk the floor, and I'm like,
Uh-huh.
I have a smile from ear to ear looking at all of these new projects coming out. And I come by and I'm like, give me your elevator pitch. Tell me about your game. And just hearing these wonderful new ideas hitting our space that, like, gatekeepers would have shut down because they'd be like, "Oh, that's just way too weird or way too fringe." You probably only have like 10,000
Yeah.
people in the world that are going to love it. But in this day and age, 10,000 people is enough to float a company by Kickstarter after Kickstarter. So it's like,
Mhm.
this is a great idea. Let's go with it. And I think we're living in this space where we got this innovative snowball that's going, because you're seeing all of these things, and whether you like it or not as a designer, like, subconsciously you're going like, that works, that works, that works, that works, and you get to your next
Mhm.
project, you're putting all these pieces together, and then you're moving something else forward. And we're no longer in that stagnation of, okay, it's a stat plus a bonus plus a die roll. Like that was the paradigm for what, 20 years or 30 years of role-playing games.
Yeah.
And now we're just light speed of innovation.
I'm endlessly fascinated by the movement among younger game designers. One of the games that I think is probably the most compelling. There's two really cool RPGs I played this year. One was a journaling RPG called Thousand Year Old Vampire,
Yeah.
which
Oh,
I just started a month and a half ago. It's
I
so
love the
cool.
layout of
Love it.
that book. Oh my god, it's one of the
Yeah,
most beautiful books
yeah.
I own. I love it.
It's like it's like a storybook or a really fancy journal. Like, I love the tactile feel of the book. I
Gorgeous.
bought the book and the dice. I had to have the dice with the I think
Gorgeous.
Die Hard Dice. I think it's where they did the dice for it. But I bought that and started playing that.
Uh,
And the other game that I thought was really intriguing, I haven't an opportunity to play yet, which came out I think last year, was called Alice is Missing. The game that's played completely silently with cell phones.
really?
I'm just, yeah, I'm fucking fascinated with like this new innovative
Wow.
ways of playing RPGs. And granted, it is only like a kind of a one shot thing. You can't, but
What is it
the
called? I'm
truth of the
I'm
matter
typing
is,
it in
like,
right now.
oh,
Alice is what?
Alice is Alice is missing. Um,
Okay, I'm gonna be
and
looking that up after.
I believe the creator of the game, whose name escapes me, he actually works. I think he works for Critical Role now. He's like their social media guy, I think. But it won an Emmy. I mean, it won several Emmys, and I think I think it also won the Breakout Award from Independent Game Design Network. I think I don't quite recall, but it's a really interesting game, and it plays toward the idea of, like, let's get together, let's have a casual game, let's do something in a short period of time. And the reason why that is so compelling to me is because inevitably at the end of every Gen Con day, there are people in the halls playing pickup casual games that are so interesting. They're all different games. It's so cool to see.
Yeah,
And I love walking the hallway, like, because after the show I always walk the hallway and just listen on people's games are playing, to the wee hours of the morning. Not the table, not around, sit around the table and roll dice games, but like
yeah.
the games they're doing that people make up and play outside the convention hall are so cool. And I think that, especially now, because the barrier to entry is so low with Kickstarter and Twitch, and the opportunity to create your own games and kind of exist beyond the trad RPG world, we're kind of entering in this whole new phase, I think, for the game industry around what a game really is, or how it could be played. And that's where the innovation stuff comes out. But I always go back to these games are kind of born out of those casual games I see outside the Gen Con halls, and I'm just endlessly fascinated with them. I don't regularly play them, but I buy them and I read them because I find them very, very inspirational. Because there are way better game designers out there than I am. Much more innovative. They're younger. They've got a different mindset. They have different experiences. Those are the people I love to bring on to freelance with us, because they bring it's like a whole different paradigm
They open up
um,
the creative space.
shift for us.
Yep.
They really do. They really do. Like we talked earlier about like designing in a box. And that's and I think all creators, I certainly struggle with like the need from my ego to be in the work I'm creating versus what is actually good for the gaming audience. That's a tension I think a lot of game designers kind of face. Some people rely on line editors to kind of push through that. Um, but I try to remain humble as I can and wholeheartedly listen. Otherwise, I will miss out on what people really want to play. And a lot of that informed um, how we looked at Zweihander Starter Kit.
Yeah, but you have to be happy too. That's one of the important things too. Is I'm always
Yeah,
told the
yeah.
designer, do not just pander to your audience and make something the audience loves, but you don't want to play yourself. Make sure it's something you want to play yourself. That is absolutely important. Do not
It's,
lose sight of that.
it's very true. I was told very early on in my career when I was in my 20s, one of my mentors, he said, only work on projects you're passionate about, only work with people who inspire you. Um, and I carried that with me for many years. I'm 44 now, and I've had this amazing privilege to do this professionally for a traditional RPG publishing company and to bring forward a lot of people who have helped kind of expand my horizons to think about games in different ways. And I think it's so incredibly important. Like, the game, you still have to love the thing you're making. Um, you don't have to pander purely to the audience. Games are not driven by data purely. Data's helpful, but
The larger you get
most
as a company,
importantly,
though, you do fall into that trap. That's what happened with
yeah,
WotC and
yeah,
iterations of D and large companies. They'll start pandering
yeah,
to the audience and the trends. They'll be like, oh, where are the trends going? Where are the Excel spreadsheets
yeah.
telling us to go?
It's really interesting. So I have a lot of friends who work at Wizards, both as full-time employee, as associates, as well as freelancers, ranging from artists and developers and editors. And I think what D&D is doing now is incredible. Um, they are using surveys to survey people. They're using social listening tools to understand what people want. And now you can be a fucking space goo or you can be an owl person, and that's great for D&D. That's not what I want to do, but it's great for D&D. Now, whether that's bad for the hobby, I don't know. Is it bad that people like Britney Spears? I don't know, but it's fucking Britney Spears. So, like she has an audience. D&D has an audience, and I think our opportunity is to lock that audience to bring them to other games like ours, and that's tough. That's difficult. We know that it's like here's this big, massive audience who wants to play, the Kleenex of RPGs,
Yeah.
right? Everybody knows D&D,
Okay, it's an uphill
right?
battle
It's
for
a
sure.
lifestyle.
Yeah.
It really is. So it is, and it's great that you can literally be anything in D&D now. Like I said, you could be a living goo. I saw the recent Unearthed Arcane. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. Never when I was a kid would I expect to be able to do anything like this. It was cool, and like I was like, oh my god, Draconians, a Dragonlance, Kinder, what the fuck are these? These are
Yeah.
amazing. But now you can be literally anything. So, and that's cool. But is that the right approach for Zweihander? No. Is the right approach for other games? No. It's because each game has its own desires from its creators. And there is a danger. There is a danger listening too much to your audience, especially if the only audience you're listening to are the ones who are present on social media. Because social media represents it's significant but insignificant when compared to the broader RPG audience. It's significant among younger gamers. It's insignificant among uh, middle-aged gamers and older gamers too. So, but it's also tricky.
Hmm.
Like, how do you create a game that is evergreen, meaning it, like you and I would understand this. Like, it's how does this game still appeal to the old D&D heads, but also be cool for like new younger gamers who want to experiment with gender and experiment with sexuality, experiment with race and ancestry and culture, in the way that you do that in any role playing game is like play something you are not. So whether it's bad or not, I don't know. I know that listening strictly to one audience is bad, but D&D is seeing wild success. So kudos to them. But that's not who I am as a creator. It's not who we are at Anders McNeil as a role playing game producer. We have a very specific vision for horror fantasy,
Hmm.
or dark, for lack of a better term, dark fantasy. I kind of graded that word because it just to me it always screams gatekeepery. But horror fantasy is like a much more palatable way of saying that. We think that we can do things different than the high fantasy can do, and in ways that are just as intriguing, and tell stories that can appeal to everyone, in the sense that we can explore alternative selves through this lens of catharsis, through the lens of like mystery and horror and investigation. To me, there's something there that people want. It's the reason why Game of Thrones is successful. It's the reason why Witcher is successful. It's the reason why Berserk, one of the second longest running manga in the world, is so successful. There's something there that people want above and beyond the traditional high fantasy thing. And that to me is like why I feel, that's Zweihander is important to me, but I hope people like look at it when the starter kit comes out and be like, I remember back when I was 22, like I picked my first starter kit and it was this Zweihander one. That'd be so cool. I mean, that'd be so amazing. I'd be so humbled if that was the case. In the same way that I can look at, I still have my original Dungeons and Dragons box set, the one that was given to me by my cousin, like not the red box, but the D&D box set. It's in the shadow box on my wall. And I want to be people to look back and be like, yeah, I remember picking up my first RPG and it was that set, whether it's Ragnarok, whether it's Sviner, whatever it may be, because
It
people
feels
are looking for
great.
other games that are not D&D.
It feels
Yeah,
great when it's your first game. I remember we were down at
yeah.
Dragon Con, and Richard tells the story because he was there when he ended up pulling in a few players to fill in a couple of seats for one of our evening games. And he says he was watching some players walking in, and some girl looked completely dejected, and her boyfriend's trying to like perk her up, and he's like, "What's happening? Like, we should join a game. Like, cheer up." And she's like, "I just played my first game of D&D. My boyfriend forced me to play. I hated it. It was horrible." Da, 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 da.
Oh,
And he's like, "Well, you got to play a Viking game." And he sat her down at our table. And at the end of the game, she's like, "I thought I'd hate RPGs, but I love RPGs." And we turned her around. And it was such a nice
what?
story that he said. Like, it was one of those, like, feels good that your game ended up making someone that was ready to give up on their first experience with role playing games completely do a 180.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing is like, so D&D, like we think about like the traditional genres of RPGs. We think about, okay, high fantasy, low fantasy, alternative fantasy, and D&D is not high fantasy. I mean, this is the big misconception. Is D&D is a genre now,
Yeah.
right? And so by moving her to a Viking game, which is a totally different genre, like that's where you start to like really feel out like there are these other things you could do with RPGs that are not just about playing D&D, because D&D is its own beast.
Well, she
Um,
was like,
yeah,
she was going. Everyone at the table was quizzing me. What's my modifier? What do I need to add to my die roll? Da da da. She goes, all I was
oh,
doing was math. And she goes, at least here I was like telling a story. I was pushing a rune forward, and people were like, describe what you're doing. And she was telling a story. And she was like, is this what role playing games are? We're like, yes, that is what role playing games should be. To not be about the math. The math should fade into the
yeah,
background. If there is math, it should fade into the background, and it should be about the narrative, the story. You should be imagining what's on the table, and that's what like a successful like
yeah.
system should be coaxing out. Um, so someone had sent me a message. They wanted me to ask you, had you played Warhammer Fantasy, and why was your game compared to Warhammer Fantasy?
That's a great question. So my first role playing game was Dungeons and Dragons, and then I was given a copy of Maelstrom. Maelstrom, I don't know who the original creators was, but it had this. It took place in England, had this really cool adventure in the back, and you're journeying to an old abbey. And I think this was eventually reprinted over time. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is based off of Maelstrom.
Yeah.
Full stop. I don't think a lot of people know that, but the price lists are the same. The career system, the same. The skill system, similar. but clearly the same. Like same thing with Stormbringer when Games Workshop did the Elric saga prior to Warhammer. So there's a lot of comparison there. So whenever I wrote Zweihander, it was born out of my love of D&D. It was born out of my, at the time, I wasn't satisfied with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Third Edition, and in fact, it was the game that I wrote, which was called Corehammer, was never intended to be published. In fact, I wrote the game for my friends. I was given a copy of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Second Edition by the owner of my favorite local gaming shop, Game and Hobby. That's a guy named Phil, and he said, you should really try Warhammer. I'm like, well, I liked Maelstrom, and I just don't think my players would ever be into like skill-based games. And then we tried it, and I'm like, holy shit, this is amazing. So I basically took that and turned it into our home game system for my own game world. And at the time, I was like, maybe other people will like this. I don't know. So I found Strike to Stun online. And Strike the Stun was like where Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay fans were at. So I started kind of talking with people there, and I was like, yeah, I'm working on this kind of homebrew thing based off the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Maelstrom system. Here, check it out. And like people glommed onto it because at the time, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Third Edition came out. There was like this big, like, I think older Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay fans were like embattled against Fantasy Flight because they didn't want to play a board game, is what they called it. Although I thought it's really cool. It has a lot of cool things in it. So I was like, well, maybe I should publish. I don't know. And then my friends at the table, who are the playtesters, were like, you should actually write a book. And I'm like, oh my God, I've never written anything in my entire life. Are you fucking kidding? And so I start writing and I put it out there, and like people are like, this is really neat. It's really interesting what you're doing with the system. And so I'm just interacting with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay fans, talking about their home games, the things that we're doing in our game. I don't really have a lot of love for the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay world. I love the themes. I don't like the game world because the system was just so married to my home game. So then eventually I was like, well, maybe there's an opportunity to publish. And this is like, gosh, this would have been 2017, I think, when I brought it to Kickstarter. I was like, I'll sell 100 books and hopefully I break even. So I turned it into Zweihander, and adapted some kind of like the themes of Warhammer into Zweihander, and then wrote some kind of like facsimile stuff from Warhammer to Zweihander to make sure like it had a mass appeal to Warhammer fans. But it kind of grew into its own thing fairly quickly. It was very evident, like when it was getting play tested by people beyond our game table, like there was like this desire for like a dark fantasy game that used the profession system. Like I love the professions or the career system of Warhammer. I love career-based systems. I love percentile games. There's something really easy to and
Well, it's
elementary to understand
intuitive.
about
It's very
percentiles.
easy. Everyone
Yeah,
understands
very
0 to
intuitive. Like
100. Yeah.
I,
What's my?
yeah, everybody's had a paper graded in school,
Yeah.
right? We know what our chances of success are. Like to me, like the D20 is a very erudite and usual die, as those other dice to
Oh,
determine
dice
success.
pools. Dice
So
pools is the toughest one for players to wrap their heads
yeah,
around.
yeah. So I knew that like I wanted to use percentile system. I knew that if I was going to turn Zweihander into a success, it has to like attend to both people who want to create their own game worlds, but also be attractive to Warhammer fans. I was like, all right, the marketer in me, the advertising guy in me is like, all right, if I can marry these two things together, I think I could sell 100 books, maybe. And this is in 2017, and then it just skyrockets. $67,000 Kickstarter in 2017. First time writer, never did anything like that. There's another 138,000 on CrowdOx, and it's suddenly I'm like, oh my God, I'm sitting on, $250,000 in sales. I can't do print on demand. I should do a better book. Maybe I should try doing this for real. So it grew into a very real thing at that point. So Warhammer fans were attracted to it, and during the process of layout, that's when Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Fourth Edition was announced. So I think a lot of people like it's a natural comparison. I was talking to Warhammer fans. I was putting it in front of them as the alternative Third Edition because I knew that's the way I can make the Kickstarter successful, but also trying to introduce them to the idea of you can use it for the old world, but it's really meant to teach you how to make your own Grim Perilous game that you can divorce it from Warhammer the same way as I was able to divorce the mechanics and reflow them and make them in kind of an old school appeal, new school feel is what I used to call it. it felt like more modern game design because everything worked together kind of superfluous or kind of worked together better, I guess you could say, um, than kind of the disjointed systems of Warhammer of old. So the comparison is very natural, and a lot
Yeah.
of people still use it to play Warhammer. But that's not the game that we played it with. We played it with my home game world, which was dramatically different than Warhammer. But you can see in some of the campaign scenes in the back of the book, there's actually some parts of my own game world in there that I use as examples. There's one called Gangs of Cahabro that's like
Yeah.
inspired by the movie The Warriors. It's a gang warfare that takes place in a medieval city. There's several seeds in there, but yeah, so the comparison is
That's
inevitable,
awesome because I
and it's
didn't
really
even
hard.
think about it because I hadn't played Warhammer Fantasy since the
Yeah,
early '90s. I haven't touched this in maybe like '93, so it didn't even occur to me until the question came through. Because the version you had talked about intrigued me, the one with the box that they had all the little fiddly bits there. I was looking at the back and it was like
yeah,
I think it was Fantasy Flight Games that was publishing it, and I was like, it looks
yeah,
really
yeah.
interesting, but I never pulled the trigger on it. But it always intrigued me. But the only experience I have is with the very first edition of Warhammer Fantasy.
I own the entire Warhammer Fantasy Third Edition line.
Wow.
I love it. I love the cards. I love the chits. I love the accessories. I'm just so intrigued by it. The game breaks down when you start adding more professions and when you start getting higher level. But it's a great experience. But there was a very strong kind of pushback by traditional Warhammer gamers against that. And um, now that I think that this kind of leads to a question around like what's the difference between Warhammer and Zweihander? And the answer is go play Warhammer if you like the old world. And that's the honest truth. The Warhammer system is built for the old world, full stop. Zweihander is built for making your own dark fantasy games. And in our starter set, we're trying to kind of like we're distancing ourselves even further from the Warhammer roots with our finally bringing my game world into the box, removing some of the story stuff, the narrative kind of connective tissue, cutting that tissue away and letting it stand on its own, because it is now what we hear from players. Like a lot of players are once again using it to homebrew their own things. Um, but when people say like, why would I play as Zweihander if I got Warhammer? I'm like, you shouldn't. Go play Warhammer. That you don't play in the old world, play Warhammer. Warhammer is the best role playing game to experience the old world in. But if you want to make your own dark fantasy or your own horror fantasy world, if you like the profession system of Warhammer, if you like that the elementary understanding of percentile dice, Zweihander is that game. It's a toolbox, much more so than Warhammer is. Warhammer is built for Warhammer. Zweihander is built for building your own thing, and it's been wildly successful for that, both from a sales perspective as well as just a general excitement.
Sign me
That's
up.
led to some really yeah, it's led to some really interesting projects that we've done in the last 2 years, one of which just released on Kickstarter, about 60 days ago or so, is now in back because Blackbirds,
Blackbirds. Let's
which is
talk
just
about
a
Blackbirds now. Yeah.
yeah,
Perfect segue.
yes. So Blackbirds is really interesting, and it's a little bit of a story to this. So there's a television series, animated series called Tigtone that ran on Adult Swim and is now run on HBO Max, and it's basically like imagine like an over the top like D&D adventure. That's what Tigtone is, and it's produced by I can't remember who produces it, but it's a really fun, dark, hilarious show. Like it's very cerebral in some ways. In other ways, it's like totally like dorky as shit. So one of the writers on it was this guy named Ryan Vernier, and I reached out to him and I was like, "Hey man, I love Tigtone. I just wanted to like, hey, thanks so much for like writing on Tigtone. It's so cool." And he's like, "Hey, we just bought Zweihander and we're converting our entire game to it." And I'm like, "Oh, that's cool, great. Let me send you a stack of books." So he and I can like get to know each other. And I ended up going to stay with him in Sherman Oaks out in California. Turns out he's the lead narrative writer at Riot Games for League of Legends.
Oh, well.
He is a regular player at Joe Manganiello's D&D table. He met him at GaryCon, coincidentally. he's like gaming with Vince Vaughn and the guys who wrote Game of Thrones and Big Show and Tom Morello and all these like, big nerd like D&D Hollywood guys. So I'm like, well, that's really intriguing. And what's interesting is like, well, yeah, I've been creating this world called Blackbirds that I ran in my D&D for my D&D group. We've been running it for years. So it's like him and like Chris Pronosky, like the founder of Titmouse, and like all these other writers at Riot Games, all these other novelists, and all these really cool, like really interesting, creative people. And he's like, I really want to like turn Blackbirds into something using this Vikinger game engine. I'm like, well, shit. Let's get you out here in Kansas City, and you can pitch our president of publishing. So, you know, months later, after several creative calls, and he and I just kind of shooting the shit over the things that we love about games, like comes out, he pitches the president, and it's like, yes, this is it. Let's make it. So he assembles this team of wildly creative writers and artists. I mean, the team is phenomenal. It includes Dave Raposa, the cover artist who like did the
The,
cover art. People would probably recognize him
the art
for his
looks
work on
awesome.
Logan.
And it's right there. Look,
Oh,
we've got it
it's
above you
wild.
on the
Yeah,
stream, so I don't know if you see it, but like we've put it out there because it's
yeah.
really eye catching.
Francesca Belrald, she's working for everybody now. She worked for Blizzard. She works for. I just saw she did the map for Vaesen. It just released on Kickstarter today. She's this amazing cartographer. She hand draws everything and watercolors it. Writers Jared Rosen, John Chambers, Zoe Quinn, Ifinawaldi. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. All of all this incredible talent just assembles them into like the super team, and they create over the period of like a year and a half, a totally different game than what Zweihander is. They take that engine and he marries it with all the really Ryan marries it with all the really cool, rich world building he had wrote for Blackbirds, and the team just kind of continues to augment and build and grow. And now Blackbirds has taken flight, and has been it's his first RPG he's ever written, Ryan. But it really speaks to his talent, the talent of the team you brought forward. It's raised, I think it's around like $200,000 right now on backer
Doing
kit.
phenomenal.
It's wild. I know it's wild, and we're so blessed to have the opportunity to publish him and his team's work. It's really cool. The world of Erebos is really compelling, and the ways that they took the rules, that to fit the narrative like is really interesting. And he's just crazy talented. I'm terribly jealous of him, because he is such an experienced writer and a great storyteller. And I'm really excited for us to get Blackbirds out. We're gonna release it next year, at Gen Con. We haven't announced that yet, but I guess it's
There's
formal
an
now.
exclusive right here.
So
We got the scoop here on
yeah,
the
so
fireside.
I think we're gonna do it at Gen Con. And we partnered with some really cool people on the Kickstarter. We're doing Dave Raposa's art is featured on a Death Saves T-shirt, which we did for the Kickstarter. We worked with Dogmite Games to create this amazing kick-ass piece of collector's wooden game screen of the Norns. It's so cool. And the world tree, it's really neat. We work with campaign coins to do fortune tokens and
Oh, those
amulets.
look so cool.
Yeah. Norse Foundry did our gemstone dice. I mean, it's weird to think about, like in retrospect, like when I was 11 years old and I first started playing D&D, I never conceived of anything like this. And Blackbirds is like everything that I love about games, and the partnerships and just the creative talent that Ryan and the team brings forward. I'm just lucky to be a small part of it. They use the game engine. I edited the work. I'm technically the acquisitions editor for it. Um, but I get to be a small part to play in it. But it's really cool to see this come to be, to see what's in Ryan's head come onto paper. I think people are going to love it. The often I think we kind of talk internally like this. Imagine what Vampire the Masquerade or Werewolf would look like if it were a dark fantasy percentile game. Through the lens of like dark fantasy, horror fantasy, um, with swords and cool shit like that. So we're really stoked about it. It's going to be 2022 is going to be kind of wild for us. and Blackbirds is our tentpole IP.
It
It's going
looks
to be super
incredible.
cool.
Like I love
I'm
the
so stoked.
maps. You guys have to
Yeah.
check out the maps. Whoever's like, we put the link up in chat again. Click through, check out the maps, man. It just blows my mind. I love the map. Oh my god.
Yeah, Francesca is just an amazing talent. And once again, it speaks to Ryan Vernier as the creator, as having that experience in the video game, AAA video game world, knowing the right people to like being able to, and not only just that, but to assemble a team that could work well together. Like I think you probably know this, Andrew, is that that's one of the big challenges. Like when you write a game, it's like, well, you got all these different voices, different talents, and being able to like harmonize everybody, bring everybody into rhythm and like play together. It's like jazz, and it takes a little bit of time to work through. And I think that Ryan's got he's an incredible wealth of experience and background in this, and that's what's really made Blackbirds this kind of really intriguing new entry point that we hope people will check out, because it's I of course I love it,
Oh, I know I
but I
will.
think people will really like what they see. Yeah,
I'm definitely
yeah, I
backing
think it's
this.
gonna. Yeah,
You got me with
it's gonna be
Norns and
easy to.
Yachtens and oh yeah, yeah. You had all the keywords for me here.
Yeah, it's easy to learn but hard to master. That's to me that's like the best kind of RPG. Fundamentally, principally, if it's easy to
Yes,
learn and then hard to master, like that means the
that's
game can be picked
exactly
up
what
and
I want to
played,
do. Yeah.
and and longevity. Like it has legs. It's not like something you pick up playing and you forget about. Like you can pick it up and have long-term campaigns you fun, or you can just pick it up and play once. I mean, that's the perfect RPG. This is the you mentioned earlier about some people like Fate, some people like Rollmaster, some people like, but I think as my creative mind, like I think the answer is somewhere in the middle, right? Like provide enough crunch and enough story and get it to work together, but don't lean one way or the other too hard. Otherwise, you'll lose the fringe players. You need to find the best way to kind of I feel like to bring it, make a game
Oh, it really
succtive,
depends.
and it doesn't.
I have had a
Yeah,
lot of players that are on that little edge of that bell curve. They're not in the center of the bell curve. I've had so many of those
yeah,
fringe players that are on either extreme on my
yeah.
tables that I'm like,
Well, I think
there are all kinds out there. Oh boy.
the not to get too grim, but younger gamers are going to be who we are now 20 years from now, right?
Oh,
And so this is like, not to say that you should follow the data, not you, but I mean you, the royal you, or we in this case. Um, but a lot of gamers who are coming into the hobby don't have that experience yet.
hmm
So our games, as we put them in front of them now, will probably steer them one direction or another.
Yep.
But the reality is, most gamers are coming in through the lens of D&D, through that vector of D&D. That level of moderate complexity, that level of the need to tell bigger stories, but D&D can't really let them do that. D&D is not a storytelling game. It's not great at storytelling. It can be used to do that, but it's not great at it. So people will look toward other games, like the other ones think it's more crunchy or more story driven, and people will kind of uh, vacillate
And
between them all until they figure out, like, yeah, I like this style of game, or I like this style of game, and they'll move between multiple games. But that's the opportunity for us, is to be able to try to make games that are easy to pick up and hard to master. And that, to me, is the big driver for myself when I think about like how to make a quote successful game, and not in the sense of like, let's be financially successful, because that's important, but I think it's more important for people to enjoy the games that we're making, more so than like, can we sell 100,000 copies. um, that's where my head is at, as like the as a gamer in general, is also as the lead of the department.
absolutely. I think that's one of the things that we need to carry into 2022 with all of our projects going forward. And it's just so I don't end up angering my editor, we've just gone an hour and a half on this episode without him being on as a co host. So, Aaron, I'm sorry, but see, when you're not here, I just keep rambling with my guests, and we can go on for like 2 hours easy. So, to make it a little bit easier for him, we will try to wrap it up right now. If there are any questions from chat, now is the time to ask our guest in the hot seat. for anything that is Blackbirds or Zweihander or RPG related. Otherwise, I will ask you to just basically list off where can everyone find you on social media, all of your link tree info.
Yeah. Well, I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk just for a moment about some of the talent that's working with us on our games, especially on Starter Kit. One of our writers is James Introcaso. He worked for many years at Dungeons and Dragons. He's working at MCDM now. He wrote the adventure for Starter Kit. Dan Mandic, our Serbian artist who's done all the art for all his Zweihander, is is doing all the art for Starter Kit. Kyle Latino, who joined us with Flames of Freedom, he's doing all the cool maps inside. He and Diane's style like just mesh so well together. They're so cool. I really want to share some. He's been sharing it out across social, but Kyle's maps are really cool. And then Kate Bullock, who works for Magpie Games, she helps us kind of amp up the horror and really make Starter Kit special. And we of course have these other contributors who have made it also super cool too. For the playtesters at Grim Parallel Studios, Tom Grant, who's our lead playtester, and Anna Goldberg and Irene DB and Jen Staub here at Andrews McNeil. I mean, we have this really wildly talented group of people who have turned what was, initially just my silly little basement game for our home game into something that's been wildly and strangely commercially successful, which is humbling and awesome. And I'm just thankful for any opportunity that I get to be on an interview such as this one and to talk about how cool it is just to do this with a bunch of talented people. It's a rare privilege to make games professionally, especially with talented group of writers and editors and artists. So if people are looking to find me anywhere, the best place to go is just my Twitter, Zweihander RPG, and I have a link tree. I have a Discord. We have a Zweihander Discord. We have a Twitch channel. It's all kind of interconnected, but it's best just to reach me at Twitter. And that's where I post a lot of ramblings about Zweihander and other games because I love interacting with people about games, and that's kind of that's when I'm not writing, I get to go on Twitter and talk about games, and that's really my other outlet. So thank you so much for letting me do this. This is super cool.
Dan, I'm super happy you're part of our industry. You're an amazing person with amazing products. Hopefully, we'll have you on for a future product. Until next time, goal.
Skull.